Good morning, Vinnings Lake, and welcome to another Quarantine Sunday. Okay, I'm so glad you're with us. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. If you're a part of the Vinnings Lake Collective, if you've been around, you're back with us. Welcome to you as well. Today's going to be a great day. This is part 2 of a series that we started last week called Religious Trauma, Finding a Path of Healing from Toxic Religion. Now, I told you last week that this series has been guided by a few counselors and certified therapists. Today, I thought it would be good in this second installment to just go ahead and step into a conversation with one of those therapists that I just recently met for the first time in this interview, actually. And she comes referred to by a close friend. And I'm so grateful that she said yes. And as you'll see, she's got it. She's got fire. She's got so much depth and intellect, and I'm so grateful that she's able to speak into us. So let me introduce her. Her name is Connie A. Baker, and she is a professionally certified counselor. She specializes in religious trauma and recovery, and she's also an author. She's written this book right here, Traumatized by Religious Abuse. Subtitle, Discover the Cultures and Systems of Religious Abuse and Reclaim Your Personal Power. I just finished reading this. I highly recommend it to you. She, with such simplicity, lays out so much depth that we'll get to just a portion of it in this conversation. And then maybe, who knows, maybe we bring her back for a second part talking about healing and restoration. So, all that said, we're going to start this interview. I hope that it's helpful for you in your journey. Friends, this is part 2 of Religious Trauma. I sit down and have a conversation with the certified therapist herself, Connie A. Baker. Well, Connie, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and being with us today. A couple of things. One, I just finished reading your book, and I have a few questions that I want to give you, and I think it will be helpful to just elaborate on a few of these questions. However, before we get into all of that, probably lots of our folks are not familiar with you or your work or even your story, and even in the book, the opening chapter, actually, you talk about your own spiritual abuse and your story, and you actually thread it throughout the entire book. But you elaborate a lot on it in the opening chapter. Would you mind sharing with us a little bit about your story, how you chose the path that you're on currently?
Mm-hmm. I'd love to. Cody, I'm so thrilled to be here. Yes, I'd be happy to talk about my story. It's a pretty public story now that it's in print and YouTube and stuff like that. So I was born and raised in a very, on one hand, a very loving, supportive home. My parents were in many ways were very good parents. And they were also very rigid. They were 2 firstborns, if that tells you anything. And I was their firstborn. So things were really pretty rigid. And you did it the right way or the wrong way, and all those things. And hyper responsible. My parents are extremely responsible. I was raised to be that way. So I say that in terms of spiritual abuse to set the stage for what was to come. And when I was 19 years old, I began attending a church in Portland, Oregon. I moved 300 miles away from Southern Oregon to attend Bible school. And at 19, I started going to a church that I just fell in love with. I mean, I literally never came into a church and loved it as much as I did that one. And I invested, I always say I gave my blood for that place. And I was heading overseas as a missionary. And my first, I believe my second Sunday, I met one of the pastors, and we kind of struck up a connection, and we were just chatting, and I said, I love this church. And so through the years, he and I became very close. I called him my dad in Portland. And he was supportive. He helped me keep moving toward the mission field. And 6 years in, he started making sexual advances. And for 9 months, he sexually abused me and trapped me. He said, you can't tell anybody because I'm emotionally unstable and there's a gun by my bed and I will kill myself if you do. And I was at that point, as they might say in cultural/clinical terms, a raging codependent. So I was doing everything I could to rescue this guy while he was abusing me, but I was trying to keep him alive. When things came to the forefront, the church leadership blamed me. They were very angry with me, and our church had a tradition of church discipline, and I was required to stand up in front of the church in 2 services and confess my sin, and I did, and I was beyond confused at that point, but I took full responsibility, and I confessed my sin. And then they said, you need to leave and move back down to where you grew up 300 miles away with your parents. And I was 25 at this point. And it was unspeakably devastating. At that age and that developmental level, my identity was shattered. I don't know a better word for it. My reputation was utterly destroyed, and I had a really good reputation. I was in leadership all over the place. I was a young, up-and-coming evangelical, and it was utterly devastating. It was like a volcanic eruption that wiped out. We've got Mount St. Helens here in the Northwest, and that's a great metaphor. It's like this mountain's never the same. It's a different place, and that's how it felt. So through the years, I slowly, and I don't say this to be discouraging, but no one knew what spiritual abuse was. Nobody was talking about religious or spiritual abuse. I use those words interchangeably, by the way. So nobody was talking about this. And so I didn't know what had gone on. It took me about 10 years to get on my feet. It was a decade where I finally said, I think I can thrive. I think I can go on with my life and feel spiritually and socially and personally like I can keep going. And so that was a huge, long, involved recovery experience because I didn't know how to recover. No one around me knew how to help me. No therapist. I went to a therapist who said, well, it's good you're accepting responsibility for your sin. And it's like, and I didn't know. I mean, it was just reinforcing exactly what I had been told and what I accepted. So, but at some level, I knew it was unhelpful because I didn't go back. So good for me.
Totally.
As a young woman. So, and through the years, in my late 30s, I decided I was going to go back to school, and I got my counseling degree. And I think all along I kind of knew what I wanted my specialty to be. And as I went through school and got into practice, my private practice, I started saying, I want to go back and really process that part of my life in a public way, in the sense of allow other people to hear my story and to start defining. Part of my heart, Cody, is we don't have a good definition for this thing yet, socially and culturally. We don't. If somebody says sexual abuse, as a society, we get that. 60 years ago, we didn't. 60 years ago, there was just societally, we didn't know quite how to define it, and it was weird and not quite right. But now we get it. We are, I think, with spiritual abuse where we were 50, 60 years ago with sexual abuse. And so nobody can define this thing. And part of my passion has been to define and describe what does this look like? Because people go through it and they're like, I don't know what I just went through.
That's right.
It has devastated me, but I don't know what it was. And that was me. I wrote the book for me at about 2 years post abuse. I thought, what did I need? Not right out of it, because I don't think I could have absorbed my book at that point. But within a year to 3 after, what did I need to help me start trying to make sense of what I've gone through. So this defining and describing what is this traumatic, horribly traumatic thing called religious abuse. So that's my quick overview story.
Okay. So many questions. Okay.
So
Let's talk about defining spiritual abuse. Okay. Because even towards the end of the conversation that you just had, you talked about how there wasn't a lot of language around when this happened to you. Now, I would just ask this question, and you actually talk about this, I think it's in the first section of your book, chapter 1 or chapter 2, you talk about defining these terms.
Yes.
So let's talk about that for a minute. How do you define spiritual abuse? How can one identify spiritual abuse? And then for those that are listening online around the world that maybe are like, that actually sounds like something I've experienced, but it's a brand new idea. Is this field, like religious trauma or spiritual abuse, is this field in its infancy currently?
Oh, if it's even been fully born yet, yes. In some ways, when I started this 15 years ago, it was embryonic. I mean, it was just nobody, it was barely a thing. And I feel like it probably is being born right now. People are starting to say, here's a thing. It's in its infancy of this definition and figuring out what this thing is. So I'll be speaking this fall at a school in Texas, online, of course, because of COVID, but online in Texas. And they're one of the first ones that I've heard of. And there's been a few that I've heard of where we're doing a full conference on this topic. There was another one in Pennsylvania I was connected to that got canceled. It was an in-person. But yeah, so it's in its very infancy. And that's why people are like, when they say, what do you specialize in your work? I say, oh, religious abuse. And they're either like, oh, that is so needed. Or they're like,
right.
They don't have a clue what I'm talking about.
Right.
So, it's usually one or the other. There's not because we're still learning.
Yeah.
So, so when we talk a little bit how I define it.
Please, yes.
Yeah. So as a clinician, I believe that any abuse consists of a power differential. Where one person or group of people or institution has more power than the person being abused. And this power can be perceived or real. This is true of spiritual abuse. So how I define it is the abusive person or institution has some sort of power that the abused person does not have, and they use that power usually leveraging God or spiritual or religious ideas. So that's going to be part of the leverage specifically. And then they leverage that power that they have to manipulate or control, hurt, exploit, suppress, silence, weaken. That's a lot of words, but I try to, all those words, to weaken that other person in some way and the thing about that definition is it doesn't always hurt at the beginning. When you're being exploited, sometimes you're not aware of that. When you're being manipulated, sometimes you're not aware of that. So eventually it's going to hurt. But it has to do with power being leveraged using God or some religious idea to control or manipulate or hurt another person.
Do you mind if I read a portion of your book?
Sure, go for it.
You said this, to your point about power differential, on page 27, you write, by definition, any abuse consists of some type of power differential, where one person has more power than the other and hurts the other person with that power. This is true of spiritual abuse. This power can be perceived or real. This power can be held by one religious person, I think this is interesting, or a small or large group of religious people, or it can be implicit in the rules of the entire religious organization. Yes. The abusive person or institution has some sort of power that the abused person does not have and uses that power, usually leveraging religious ideas or the idea of God, what you just said, to manipulate, control, hurt, exploit, suppress, silence, or weaken the other person.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I love your emphasis on that one part that I think most people don't quite catch. They usually see it, if they understand spiritual abuse, they see it as one pastor, leader, one person being mean to another person. Now, is there, in essence, is there truth? Yes, but there's also a much more subtle but powerful place of that power being held by a group of people or just the rules of a whole institution, where they are so powerful that you can't not obey the rules without dire consequence, without getting hurt or exploited or suppressed or weakened. So yeah, that's a whole nother topic, but I wanted that in my definition, that it's not just always one person doing the abusing.
That's right.
That the power can be held by an institution.
Okay, so Connie, so the title of our series is religious trauma. So I want to talk about these two, and then I want to talk about kind of defining a little bit of trauma and religious trauma. So would you interchange spiritual abuse and religious trauma? And as a therapist, how do you define, okay, let's start here. How do you define trauma? Then how would you define religious trauma? And do you think the idea of trauma, the label of trauma, is it possible for that label to be overused in our generation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are such good questions. So the first one I believe was how do I define trauma?
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of definitions for it, but how I would define it when I'm thinking when I'm working with one of my clients, how I would define it as it's a response to something deeply distressing or disturbing, often perceived life-threatening events that can overwhelm a person's ability to cope. They can lose their ability to feel a full range of emotions. Another characteristic of trauma is usually the person that's traumatized has a physical reaction to events that echo the actual trauma, the initial event. Mm-hmm. So they would call those triggers. That's a cultural word now. But the issue is a physical reaction, like heart rate increase, breathing increase, sweating, blood pressure goes up, whatever it is. So I always use the illustration of a veteran who comes home and has been in combat and has really seen horrible, and maybe been injured, seen horrible things, and has been in life and death situations, and they hear a car backfire. That car backfire creates the same physiological reaction in their body as a gunshot, even though within a fraction of a second their brain says that was a backfire, that wasn't a gunshot, but the brain has said so when someone is trauma is this response to something that has been deeply disturbing and distressing.
Okay, I want to kind of stop you there for just a minute. This is where it's getting interesting. Okay, so you hear people talk about, like, and I've even used this language, that was a traumatic event. Yeah. Are you, as I hear you talk, you're saying it's a response. Can the catastrophic event be a traumatic event? Is the event itself trauma? Or as I hear you saying, it's not the event necessarily, or you would even say the religious abuse or the spiritual abuse that is the trauma. It's our body's response that is the trauma.
Response.
Okay.
Yes. A quick illustration. 10 years ago, I got in 2 car accidents within 3 months, and both of them were my fault. And the second one, I just about unhinged emotionally. I rear-ended. I don't even know why. I mean, it's still a mystery to me what happened. I wasn't on my phone. I was present, but for whatever reason, I rear-ended 2 people in 3 months, and the second one just put me over the edge. I was traumatized emotionally. I kept making myself drive my car and ride in a car, but if I looked down for a minute, my husband was driving, and I look up, and he was coming on something just a teeny too quick, my whole body would go, and do that involuntary response. Okay. about 5 years later, my husband was driving. We got rear-ended. I got rear-ended. Oh, by the way, I wasn't deeply physically injured in either of those. I got a little shoulder problem in one of them, but it wasn't physically, no problem. We got rear-ended by a car a few years later. And I turned my head because my husband saw it coming, and he goes, oh, and I looked at him. And so my head went back like that, and my neck. I was in treatment for a year trying to get my back and neck together. I was totally not traumatized by that car event because of the meaning that I ascribed to it. So the meaning was, I didn't make a mistake in this one. I'm fine. Like, well, that was a bummer. This is going to be a big pain in the neck. Yeah, it was. But it's going to be a problem. It's going to be paperwork. It's going to be, and okay. And so I was actually more physically injured in that one that didn't traumatize me. So trauma often has to do with how our brain interprets threat. And how it's interpreted. So two people can go through exactly the same experience, and one be very traumatized and the other go, that sucked. That was horrible. Okay, move on, and that doesn't have to do with who's mentally even more strong or stable. It's really not even about that. It has to do with how we immediately ascribe meaning to an event. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it brings me to something that I've been thinking about for a little while, which is comparative trauma, right? So I hear this actually as a pastor occasionally, where someone will attempt to compare their abuse or their experience and almost in some ways lessen it. You know what I mean? To just be like, well, I don't even understand why I feel, trauma about this or why I'm experiencing these physiological things that are happening, because obviously, Pat over here, he went through much worse, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about, because it feels to me as a pastor, and look, I have openly said from the start of the series, I try to be as clear as I can. I am not a therapist. I'm as clear as I can with our people. I'm a pastor. That's totally different.
That. Thank you for keeping those distinctions.
I am not anywhere close to a certified therapist, so I'm very careful when I step into even counseling sessions of people that just want some type of spiritual insight or advice or whatever. But I often struggle sometimes with folks like that, because it almost feels like they're trying to use guilt to make themselves feel better.
Yes.
But what I want to say to them is, hey, you don't have to try to compare your experience to justify your physiological experiences. There's no reason or need for that. Your situation is unique to yourself.
And your whole history. We bring our whole history with us. For another person going through those two rear enders and getting hit from behind, had their grid in life been, I can't stand it when things are out of my control, being rear-ended could have been much more traumatic for them. For me, part of my grid growing up, my history is you be responsible for everything. So me being at fault and making a mistake was just blew my brain up. It really did not go well, even though the actual event, and they were pretty good rear enders. They totaled both our cars. Not that we drove really great cars, but they were pretty good rear enders. Nobody was killed. Nobody was really seriously injured. But I absorbed that because of my own history, and had nothing to do with am I mentally more strong or less strong than that other person. It didn't have to do with that. So the comparative thing, I think, yes, we do. I mean, I'm going to hear that all the time. I don't know why so people go through so much worse than I do.
Right.
You can always find somebody who's gone through less or more and different than you. Even if it looks the same, it's different. And I think we minimize it. I think often we do minimize it and go, it shouldn't be that big a deal. Try to make it smaller. Our body is saying, you're really jolted. We're shaken up by something. We're like, it's disproportionate. Oh, that's another thing about trauma. You often, with a trigger, you have a disproportionate response. My response to that second rear ender was disproportionate. And I knew it at the time. I couldn't stop sobbing. I was a mess. And I'm like, okay, I totaled a car. a part of me is like, this is not the end of the world.
Right.
We're going to live,
Right. Right.
And I'm not injured. I'm walking away, but I couldn't stop crying. And
so
it's a disproportionate response because of how my brain, specifically my brain, was wired.
And also in comparative trauma, you're asking whether the word was overused. Yes. I often say trauma with a capital T or a lowercase t. I think there's a range of trauma, and we don't get to really say for another person when we hear their experience. We don't get to say whether they're traumatized or not. Or how traumatized they're. Again, some people could have looked at me and said, Connie, pull it together. What's your issue? You rear-ended a car. And I honestly, my personality tends to take those things kind of in stride, like, ugh, stupid. All right, let's deal with this. Not, I can't stop sobbing, Right. And people could have said, what's the deal? It's like, and to say that shouldn't be a trauma. And we do that to ourselves. And sometimes we do that to other people.
Yes.
So, what's the big deal here?
Yep.
We don't get to say that. We don't know their history. We don't know how their brain and neurologically, how they're absorbing this and interpreting that experience.
Gosh, Connie, seriously, that is so helpful. I think about, we do it to ourselves and we do it to others. Yeah. I even think about, I've been married 17 years. My wife is an amazing rock, but there have been moments in our relationship where sometimes, she'll come to me and be like, "Hey, here's what I'm experiencing," and I want to fix it, and so I, sometimes without even thinking, I'll just say things like, "Why are you overreacting to this? Like, why are you not helpful, not helpful at all?"
Totally.
So it's almost like just helping all of us understand that most of us have no idea the history that we all individually bring to one particular scenario. Yeah. And this leads us into things that maybe for our people, Connie, is a new idea. Obviously going through some therapy myself and kind of deep soul work. Yeah. I'm learning a lot about childhood wounds. Yeah. I'm learning a lot about things that transpired early on in my life that has seemed to, even right now, Connie, in the midst of a global pandemic, racial injustice, we're right here in Atlanta. It's been, chaos in some ways around us. And what I have experienced is sometimes all these things in these patterns, in these grooves in my head as a child that got pressed into those waves in my brain have just built on each other. Yeah. And you come to a moment and it feels like you're overreacting, right? And it's like, whoa, what? And you start to wonder, gosh, there's a lot more than just that incident. What is all of that deep down inside of us?
Absolutely.
That's exactly right. And all of us have those. All of us have those areas where we're going to react disproportionately compared to maybe someone else. And to be able to let go of some shame around that and go, whoa, my brain's really having a heyday with this one, and to be able to be gentle with it and curious and say, what is that about? And even your question to your wife, if you tweak it, why are you overreacting? If you tweak that just a little, it's a great question. This seems like a big deal to you, honey. Talk to me. What's happening? And be able to say, man, it doesn't feel like you normally respond to something this way. What's up? How are you processing this? That can be, and even to do that to ourselves and say, hold on, instead of going, which I've got a great inner critic, Connie, pull it together. What is your problem? Come on. Really? Da-da-da-da. No, how about, Connie, what a little curiosity here, so.
Yeah.
Around trauma.
There's good people that'll save your marriage. Okay. I want to transition in just a minute, but I do want to go back to one thing you just said of just being gentle with yourself, showing some grace and kindness towards yourself. I'm currently working with basically a guide who's helping me kind of take a descent into my soul, and as I've been in the cave and just exploring, one of the things that have come to my attention is almost what you said. I have a lot of what you might define as subpersonalities, or these voices that are sometimes really critical.
Yep.
And it's something that I haven't fully been aware of until recently. And what struck me was how this guide said to me, okay, it's good you're conscious of those critical voices. He said, but one of the things that I'm observing is that you're really hard on those voices.
Yes.
And he's trying to turn it a little bit, that I noticed, to say, hey, has it ever crossed your mind that maybe those voices were your young way of saving yourself from some sense of danger?
They were survival
and
voices.
Yes, and it has changed, Connie. It's changed the way I treat myself.
Totally. I love that, Cody, because I have my clients do the same thing. Can you thank that part of you that whips you all the time? You know, can you step back and say, you know what? You saved me in my family of origin. Thank you for whipping me and keeping me toeing the line constantly. Yes, it's hurting me now. We're going to acknowledge that. And it's not proportionate. It's not appropriate for where I'm at now most of the time. But thank you, because you're just trying to help me. And if we can switch that around, I do a lot of parts work with both myself as well as my clients, and to say, oh, that mean, I've got one that actually carries a whip, you know, perform, you know,
right.
And to be able, you know, and I want to say, get out of my life, be gone, you know. It's like, no, actually, let's thank that. That actually helped me grow up and survive my family of origin in some areas. So
I have found myself, and sometimes my wife, Katie, she just smiles at me because she kind of knows, but I've found myself, when those voices kind of start surfacing, I'll pause, I'll kind of take a breath, and sometimes I'll just say it outright audibly, and sometimes I'll just say it internally, but I'll say, oh, welcome. There you are.
Yeah.
I know you didn't leave, but I do want to say to you, thank you for keeping me safe as a child. But right now, I no longer need you in this moment.
And you're not needed in this instance. Exactly. I love that. I love that work, Cody. It's beautiful.
Okay. So that's trauma. Now, how would you delineate trauma between or religious trauma? Is there a difference between the two? How would you define religious trauma?
Yeah.
I would not. Trauma is trauma. Now, what gets super messy is things that shouldn't cause trauma. If we've been raised, and I'm going to speak a little bit. Again, I was raised in evangelicalism, probably a little even on the fundamentalist side of evangelicalism, and I know that there are many backgrounds here, but there were things that you should never feel trauma around, and most of those were around the church. And around, and this is where triggers gets really interesting in the church, because if we see a veteran, and there's a backfire,
and he dives under the table, we all go, oh, we got it. Yeah, sure. You know, your brain's still healing up. No big deal. And nobody thinks twice about that. Here's the problem. In religious trauma, it hasn't been gunfire. Sometimes it's been sermons, Christian music, prayer. Some of these things that we've held most sacred.
Most church services, church buildings, all of those can be backfires for a person trying to work through religious trauma, because they're an echo of what actually hurt them. And, you know, they associate that horrible sermon, you know, some preacher preaching memories of being shamed and belittled, and they can't listen to a sermon. So it gets super confusing, especially if you're choosing to stay in the same type of faith. It can be devastating, because all of a sudden you can't pray, you can't read your Bible, or you can't go to church. All these things that you're like, these are things I should be doing, and that used to feel good. And now I'm traumatized by them. So that's the distinction with religious abuse, is often the trigger points that other people will not understand. If they're still in the system, like, why would a sermon bug you? Why would good worship music
make you want to scream and kick something, and scream.
Connie,
So
I wish if we weren't recording right now. First of all, I just need a therapy session with you. All right, so let's just throw that out because I haven't even told you this. But by the way, people, we're just meeting. This is our first meeting. But I grew up in the church, and my dad was a Southern Baptist pastor. So I grew up in a very fundamentalist background, and now I'm like 39 years old, and I reflect back on it, and there's so many layers there. I just say that to you when I hear you say things like walking into a church building. Well, now I'm a pastor, but there's so many emotions and things that run through my body of my upbringing. And there's also some pleasant emotions. My God, I'm grateful for so many things that I learned growing up.
And that shows your level of processing this whole trauma. Is what I watch with clients and people in recovery that is absolutely appropriate. Is they're over here for years and they swing that pendulum and they say, it's all horrible, it's evil, it's wrong, it's destructive. Right. And they've got a good point.
And they frankly need to be stuck there for a little while.
Yes.
They need to stick there. They need to say, what hurt me over there?
That's so good.
Now, what your
processing has shown, you're integrating. You're starting to say, wow, that sense of community as a kid, I mean, that's at least the one for me. I'm like, oh, that rural church I grew up in was beautiful. I mean, the community, the sense of what I know what community feels like from my earliest days on is beautiful. It's a gift. That church also did me many disservices and hurt me. But so all that, that mixture, often when we are deconstructing or reconstructing, we're trying to figure that out of, what was, I've got to say that most of that was just horrible, and you're swinging way over here, and it's needed. That's actually essential. It's not just, you kind of got to go through the pendulum swing.
No, it's good. You've got to develop the other set of muscles, the other set of discernment.
Yes.
To say that, no, I don't like that. My boundaries were violated constantly. I was injured. I was exploited. It destroyed me. Not good. So then to go, all right, well then through the years, usually years, not months, usually years, we go, oh, okay, here's the mixed bag that was my history in that institution, in that realm.
Gosh, I can almost map out that transition in my life because I'd always joke around, and in some ways I would say things like, if I were to write a book right now, man, like I would want to burn down the whole Southern Baptist Convention, because that's you know what I mean? And I kind of had that I was like, take it to the ground. And then I went into that stage. And Connie, so there's actually still quite a few at Vinings Lake right now that would, as overused maybe as this term is, deconstructing right now, that are deconstructing everything. And for lots of people, I remember people telling me this in my early stages of this. They would come to me and say, I'm concerned about you because you're so angry right now.
Oh my goodness, yes, 1,000,000 times. And I'm just going to say, put that as a woman, and you've got even another layer. Men have more permission to be angry than women do.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Yes, you've got even that. But yes, you're so angry. You're turning bitter. There's a problem here. So you'll get that feedback with people still in the system. Why are you so angry? That's not right. And I'm saying, good for you. Build an anger muscle. I needed to. Anger was totally unacceptable in my world. And so to be able to build an anger muscle and go, you bet I'm mad. And that's a really significant part of that swing it's essential.
Yeah.
To be really mad, and for quite a while. Now, most of us don't like getting stuck there. That gets tedious, and that's good. Our system said, all right, you've been mad for a while, and that's good. Good work.
And you're going to go back there sometimes. I still get really mad every once in a while. I hear something new. You'd think after all these years of hearing all these articles and all the horror stories that, but I still just want to go, again, so yeah.
You made this statement on page 38 of your book. You said a church that could be helpful for one person could actually be very destructive for another.
Yes. That's the subjective nature of trauma and abuse.
It's subjective. What one person sits through, I had an instance of this just recently, and I'm trying to remember what it was, but somebody else walked away saying, that was such a gift to me. That really touched me and helped me along in my journey. And I'm sitting there going, that was the most annoying thing I have ever heard.
And I had to check out, to even cope with what I was hearing,
Right.
And I
Right.
really respect and appreciate that other person. That's
Yes.
the issue. I can't dismiss them because I have a high regard for them. And I know genuinely it did help. And there was something truthful and vital for them. And for me, it was like, oh, no. I'm out.
And so it is really subjective how trauma plays out, how the impact of going through religious trauma or abuse plays out. By the way, I do think there's a bit of a distinction. Quickly, back to your question, it's the difference between religious abuse and religious trauma.
Okay.
Trauma is, I think, a broader category. I think most of the time religious trauma includes religious abuse, but maybe not always. Maybe that there isn't always a power differential.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, if you make the institution and the rules powerful, it's almost always going to have an abusive element, I believe. But sometimes religious trauma is you've just been traumatized by the ideas within the religion. So that's a little distinction.
I want to get into that. You talk about religious abuse. You said it proceeds along a fairly predictable path.
Mm-hmm.
And you give 3 steps that I saw in your book. Mm-hmm. Here's the path. Step 1, control by claim of infallibility and perfection. Step 2, mind control or groupthink. Step 3, threat of punishment. Can you speak into that pattern? Is that something that you experienced in your own story? Or is this a common pattern that you hear even with the folks that you're helping process their own religious abuse?
Yes.
Both. Yeah, I think it's pretty predictable. The claim of infallibility is what traps people. And in where I grew up, the system I grew up in, the pastor would have never gotten away with saying, I am perfect and I will never be flawed in what I tell you. People wouldn't have put up with that. Mm-hmm. But what they absolutely took hook, line, and sinker is the Bible says. Or God tells us in his word. Mm-hmm. So now we've got this claim to infallibility. And I mean, I know we all know this, but we're saying we can make the Bible say anything we want it to say. That's been clearly historically proven for audacious, horrific things. Right. So the Bible says first of all, it's crazy talk in the sense of just making it that simplistic,
Yep. So, but this claim to infallibility makes you unable to, I was just about ready to say think, which is our next step. Unable to question, unable to push back, because now I'm pushing back against the Almighty. Mm-hmm. If somebody says you're doing it, if my pastor says you're doing it wrong because the Bible says this, I'm not going to say, no, I'm fine. Because now all of a sudden God, that leveraging of a religious idea or God is in that. So that infallibility or perfection is structured. Now a cult leader, a full-on cult leader will say, I got the answer. They're going to be a little bit more explicit and audacious. But this is used in respectable religious institutions for power and control and a claim of infallibility so people don't question. It's just utilized that way. So, yes, and then you move right into the mind control or groupthink. If that is infallible, you have to think the way the group and the leader think.
Can I?
There's just no option.
Here's what you say. You write this about mind control and groupthink, and I love this. Mind control is promoted by the leader, teaching followers, here it is, not to trust themselves or their intuition.
Yep.
And then you went on to talk about black and white thinking.
Yeah.
There is no room for, God, this is huge, nuance or spectrum in an abusive system.
Right. That's over and over.
To the degree that black and white thinking and all or nothing categories are used, to me, it's pretty clear that is the degree to which the system is at least prime for abuse.
Mm.
And if you're using, on the other end, if you have a lot of spectrum, a lot of gray, a lot of nuance, a lot of thoughtfulness, it's a little harder to say you are. Absolutely, it's harder to say this is an abusive institution. Yeah, because of that, it follows with the black and white thinking.
And then your third one, the threat of punishment, I want to lead into maybe, let's see, maybe we do like one more question,
Sure.
and then we'll kind of try to wind this thing down. You talk about in your book spiritually abusive systems. You talk about spiritually abusive leaders, and then you talk about spiritually abusive messages. Yes. I want to get into that messages for just a minute because I think that plays into your step 3, which is a threat of punishment. What if you were to name like 2 or 3, and you probably have, you could probably create a whole list. I feel like I could certainly assist you with that. But what are some dominant, just to give people kind of an idea that they like, oh my God, I grew up in this, or I have heard this, or I've been subject to this. What would you say are some spiritually abusive messages?
And let me say this right off the bat with messages, as you're thinking about people sorting this out, I say really clearly when I teach on this, these can be explicit or implicit. They can be spoken or unspoken. They can be confirmed or denied. Some of these, you would never, if you came up to a pastor of a fairly respectable church and said, this is the message I'm getting, that person would be required by their own set of values, maybe not their real ones, but their stated values, to say, no, that's not what I'm saying. So some of these might be denied. So I just want to say, just because you haven't heard these words out of somebody's mouth, it's like a family. We know the rules, even if the rules are never stated.
We know, in the family we grew up in, we know what the rules are. So with that, here's a few of the messages. Don't question me or us in any way. There's no questioning allowed. There's one message. Don't you dare. You already referred to one. Don't, and it's one of my pet ones. Don't trust yourself or your instinct, because I'm the spiritual or smart one. Trust me. And then that just erodes a person and sets them up for more abuse, because they can't now say that hurt, or I don't think that sounds right. Nope, don't trust yourself. So
you know, it's interesting. I stop you there for just a minute.
Sure.
I don't think we realize, Connie. I mean, even as I say it right now, I'm starting to really understand the depth and impact of how we all view ourselves. Of growing up as a child with well-meaning good people. I need to be very clear with people that are watching this. There's no animosity right now in my heart at all. I am proud to call my parents who they are. I genuinely believe they believe they were following God, and
Totally.
and they wanted the best for me. I have a fantastic childhood. I can just tell you though that it wasn't until recent in my life that I realized the messages that I received growing up in the church about who I am has so many psychological ramifications of even those sub-personalities, those voices that keep coming out going, why would you ever, even exploring like this whole thing of the Enneagram and the number 6 and I resonate and all that kind of stuff. Now it comes back to, gosh, most of that, a lot of that perhaps comes back down to the fact that I was told at a very young age, you are a sinful, depraved, wretched human being.
The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Jeremiah.
Connie, that's the verse. That's the verse. That's it.
Yeah.
The heart is
It's
deceitful.
powerful.
So therefore, don't ever trust anything you think, feel. You are, and it creates a codependency on the church, the spiritual leader, the guru, whoever else is in your life.
Absolutely. And the irony of that is you're supposed to trust the spiritual leader, again, back to that step one, because they're speaking for God. They're speaking what, in my tradition, what the Bible said. Same as, Southern Baptist, but mine was very similar. So yeah, that whole thing, they're speaking for God. So you can't trust yourself, but you're supposed to trust their interpretation of what they're saying. And yes, so yes, that's one, that one is what, I'm glad that you connect with that, because that truly is one of mine that I just get still riled up about, because it ends up affecting how we view ourselves. So, shame on you. Huge message. Shame messages are powerful. Another one is you have to be transparent with me even if you don't want to. You have to be open. This happens in small groups. This happens. We're here to share. We're here to be vulnerable. Connie, I don't feel like you're being very vulnerable with this group.
We need to, what do and it's like, that's a huge exploitive message to say, be open and transparent, even if you're not feeling safe. And that's a whole other thing.
That's big.
Probably one of the last ones on this message that I think is don't have or show negative emotions. That one is a huge one, because it carries so much power about we can't be sad, we can't be angry, and we can't be fearful. And all of those can be justified religiously.
Okay.
So,
God, Connie, there's so much. Okay, here's what I'd like to do. Let's stop here for today.
right.
Would you be willing to come back at some point in the series and talk to us again?
More than willing. I'd be delighted.
Love it. Okay, before we close, how do you want to leave our people today? Is there, obviously we hadn't even got to your part of the story where, because I have questions about that, which we'll get into next time, if you're cool with that. I want to talk about, are you back in church? What about people, should they walk away altogether? Should they come back? I have a load of questions for that. So we'll get to the healing side of that.
Questions.
But we've spent most of our time just helping educate, really, our people and being trauma informed.
Yes.
What would you want to say to them right now in closing, of folks that maybe for the first time are like, wow, I didn't realize, but I'm just realizing that I have experienced spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, my first immediate, all my heart says you're not alone. And when we are in an abusive system, we can feel desperately alone. Like we're the only one questioning. We're the only one who's gone through this crazy, this difficulty, these traumas. So first of all, you're not alone. Number two, I come back to all the time, and this is where I want even just my very existence to say, there's hope. There's hope for thriving. There's hope. And probably third, you just alluded to it earlier, there's permission to find your own path. Spiritually, psychologically, relationally, there's options. There's freedom to say, figure it out. You've got it in you. Figure it out. Trust yourself.
Yes.
And you're gonna break your bones and scrape your knees. We're
Yep.
all gonna do that in that path. That's fine. And to be able to say, find your way, whether that be spiritually, in whatever way, to give permission to find that. So,
People, Connie Baker. Where can people go to find out more about you and your work? Obviously, I've already talked about the book, so they know about that. But do you have a website people can go to?
I do. ConnieABaker.com. You can get just about anywhere on there. I've got a Facebook group of, I think, last count, almost 660 survivors, religious abuse survivors, and it's a really sweet group. And I just, anyway, so there, I got the group, I got the book, the website, and I got a bunch of videos that you can find on my website or YouTube. So
Awesome.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, and I will.
Connie.
I'll reach back out to you, and we got to set a time because we got to hear the rest of the story. I want to hear about where you are now and all of that good
I'd love
stuff.
that.
So,
I'd
Connie,
love that, Cody.
thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.